I'm Marnie Anderson, and I'd like to thank Sabina Frustuk for inviting me to speak and Lisa McAllister for making the arrangements. Today, I'm going to talk about the relationship of two reform-minded individuals during the first few decades of Japan's Meiji period, which was from 1868 to 1912. They are Nakagawa Yokotarō and Sumiya Koume. In 1871, Nakagawa, an eccentric bureaucrat and samurai, bought out Sumiya's geisha contract and made her his concubine. Their relationship fell apart after Sumiya converted to Christianity 9 years later. The bulk of my paper is dedicated to illuminating their subsequent paths. It's my contention that their stories can tell us something about how gender roles and subjectivities changed across the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Above all, I suggest that the changes following the Restoration offered them both a new start, a chance to live their lives differently than they had in the preceding Tokugawa period. As we'll see, they both occupied places of authority within local society, the place where modernity gained concrete meaning. By studying a couple together rather than men and women in isolation, I think certain aspects of gender relations come into sharper relief. And here I have in mind the historian Kathleen Canning's discussion of the goals of gender history. Canning writes that, quote, "The most ambitious definition of gender as historical practice involves its relentless creationality," end quote. Nakagawa and Sumiya are central figures in my new book manuscript. It's a study of how networks of social and political activists in southwestern Okayama City worked to transform their world in the decades following the Restoration and extending through the 1910s. Here's Okayama on a map. Both were involved in local networks whose causes centered on the freedom and people's rights movement, Protestant Christianity, social reform, and education, especially for girls. Together with other women and men, they were part of an emergent local elite. Overall, I'm trying to understand the experience of rapid social upheaval at the individual and group level following the Restoration. The early Meiji state was a not so strong state, and the efforts of local people, men and women, were crucial in making Japan modern. They were, after all, what Carol Gluck has called the protagonists of modernity. Although Sumiya and Nakagawa both have a prominent place in my research, this paper marks the first time I have written about them as a couple. When historians talk about couples, the focus tends to be on married couples engaged in intellectual work together, such as in Bonnie Smith's wonderful The Gender of History. But this pattern does not describe Sumiya and Nakagawa. They were a couple, but not intellectual partners. At least one source claims, however, that Sumiya served as his secretary and read books to him aloud so that he could memorize them. A study of Nakagawa and Sumiya not only allows insights into the gender history of modern Japan, but also enables me to push back against existing historiographical frameworks. By highlighting relationships between people, I question the practice of treating men like Nakagawa as singular individuals without mentioning their wives or concubines, while conceiving of women only in terms of their relationship to men. At the same time, by analyzing both women and men, I challenge the tendency to conceive of activism as occurring in entirely separate spheres. Rather, I have found that most social reform networks were mixed sex in the Meiji era, even though organizations were increasingly single sex. I propose to tell Sumiya and Nakagawa's story in three parts. First, their life together from 1871 to 1880. Second, their breakup and her departure from his home. And third, their subsequent lives and the causes they worked on. In spite of the dissolution of their relationship, they continued to participate in many of the same networks, and this paper centers on the third phase of their lives. To be clear, neither wrote about the other in explicit terms. What we can surmise about the relationship comes from her published critique of concubinage, records of Nakagawa's comments, and missionary records. Several sources come in the form of anecdotes written down by friends and acquaintances, including some of the missionaries. So now to part one, background, lives, and getting together. First to Nakagawa. He was born in 1836 to an elite family in the Okayama domain, part of what would later become Okayama Prefecture. His father had served the local lords as Confucian scholars for centuries. Nakagawa's father excelled horsemanship, and young Yokotarō followed in his footsteps, teaching horseback riding to the young samurai of the domain. He married his first cousin Yuki, and they had 2 sons. Given his family background, Nakagawa was expected to excel at book learning, or at least to have some proficiency. However, he did not. Descriptions vary, but he never learned to read or write with ease. His memory was phenomenal. He memorized the entire text of the 3rd century BCE Chinese classic contend, and he explained that, quote, "Whereas my ancestors' learning came from their eyes, mine comes from my ears." Nakagawa's memory allowed him to compensate for his lack of facility with book learning. To be sure, it is hard for the historian to diagnose Nakagawa, and it's easy to assume that he had dyslexia. Surviving letters suggest that he was able to write his name using Chinese characters and using the hiragana syllabary. In other instances, he used scribes, for example, in his 2 published books. He frequently wrote letters to friends using a set of symbols that meant things such as "come for a meal," or "I need to borrow money," or "let's meet at Okoyama Station." Several anecdotes suggest Nakagawa's other strategies for coping with his challenges. He once received a letter from an admirer, Inomoto Takeaki, to which Nakagawa replied by writing down squares, triangles, and circles on a paper. An observer remarked, quote, "That looks illegible," to which Nakagawa responded nonchalantly, "Never mind, I don't understand his letter, so we are even." The end of the quote. A similar tale unfolded when government official Ito Hirobumi spent time in Okayama in the 1880s. Ito sent a letter to Nakagawa. Nakagawa later showed up at the inn Ito was staying at in the attire of a Buddhist priest. Nakagawa handed a letter to the maid. When Ito opened the letter, he found it contained nothing but lines. Ito declared, "This is the first time I have met you, and I do not know the meaning of your letter." And Nakagawa replied, "Yes, I did not understand your letter either, so I came to see you." The 2 men shared a laugh. These are the types of anecdotes that circulate about him. Another concerns names. His childhood name was Kinji or Kaneji, but he changed it to Yokotarō in his early 30s. The story goes that he did not get along with his neighbor, whose name was Morishita Tachitaro, and this inspired his new name. In contrast to the Tachi, or upright character, which comprised the first half of Tachitaro's name, Nakagawa selected Yoko, meaning sideways. His humor extended to naming his sons. One was named Tateichi, which means vertical, and the other was named Naname, which can mean diagonal. Contemporaries apparently regarded the choice as curious. Nakagawa was in his 30s around the time of the Restoration. Major changes were afoot as the country modernized rapidly. He played a pivotal role implementing change as a mid-level bureaucrat. He embraced the project of civilization and enlightenment and involved himself in the major reform trends of the day, working to help the former samurai who had lost their stipends and their status. He occupied 2 roles we normally imagine as separate. He was a government official and a local notable, a key group in Meiji society prized by the state. Indeed, Carol Gluck elaborates on this group as envisioned by central government officials. They were, in her words, quote, "imagined as conduits through which civic information passed unimpeded to its intended audience. But neither direct nor empty, the conduits had all manner of kinks in them," end quote. Gluck's observation certainly applies to Nakagawa. Central government bureaucrats no doubt did not have him in mind when they imagined local notables. But Nakagawa's primary source of income for the 1870s and 80s came from his salary as a bureaucrat. He was involved in the major political events of the day. He dealt with the Mimasaka riots against military conscription in 1873 and revolts over the new land tax. This was, after all, an extremely contentious moment. I want to move on to Sumiya now, but before I do that, let me comment on my characterization of him as an eccentric or kitin. It's not my label, but rather one that nearly all sources use and one he actively cultivated. The term comes from the Zhuangzi, the Chinese Taoist text from the 4th century BCE that reads, quote, "Strange people are seen as strange to human beings, but are equal to heaven," end quote. In the preceding Tokugawa period, some men had styled themselves as eccentrics, including the haiku poet Matsuo Basho. Hef Brusher explains that in this culture, eccentrics were quote, commonly associated with Zhuangzi's values like detachment, playfulness, and useful uselessness, end quote. So the term strange suggests an exalted and distinguished status. Sumiya was born in 1850, 14 years after Nakagawa and shortly before the arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry, who demanded that Japan open up trade with the US. Whereas Nakagawa hailed from the upper echelons of the samurai, her family came from the lower ranks. Her parent died when she was very young, probably in one of the cholera epidemics that swept the region, and her grandmother and maternal uncle raised her. She started to learn to dance and play the shamisen when she was 5, and by her late teens, she was an accomplished teacher. Out of financial necessity, she became a geisha at a well-known restaurant in 1868. This was the year of the Restoration, the year her grandfather died, and she needed to support her uncle. This is where she met Nakagawa. After he redeemed her contract 3 years later, she moved in with him, Yuki, and his 2 sons. In 1877, she gave birth to a daughter named Toyo. During the 1870s, Nakagawa and Sumiya's lives were transformed by encounters with Western doctors and Protestant missionaries. Fascinated by all things novel, Nakagawa developed an interest in Western medicine and Christianity after the ban on the foreign religion was lifted by the government in 1873. First, he brought a medical missionary, Dr. Wallace Taylor, to Okayama to serve as an advisor to the prefectural hospital. Not long after, he invited other missionaries affiliated with the American Board, the missionary wing of the Congregational Church, to deliver his sermons. They were based in nearby Kobe. At the time he met the missionaries, he was apparently sporting leather shoes, which was quite unusual for a Japanese person at the time. In retrospect, we can identify Sumiya's exposure to Christianity as a key turning point in her life, one that would lead her to subsequent involvement in multiple networks, and her transformations, in turn, affected him. This is a photograph of the first group of missionaries who set out and outstation in Okayama. There are 3 couples and a single woman seated in the front. The missionaries' presence alerted Nakagawa and Sumiya to the existence of girls' schools that Protestant missionaries were establishing around the country. In 1878, at the age of 28, Sumiya went to study at one such institution, Kobe College, with Nakagawa's backing and financial support. With the benefit of hindsight, we can say that this marks the beginning of the end of their relationship. Sumiya arrived at Kobe College when the school was undergoing a major transition. Early on, the goal had been to train Japanese students to serve as missionaries since Western missionary movements were restricted. The curriculum centered on English and Bible study, but in 1878, the school began to transform itself into a full-fledged institution offering women's higher education. Given that Sumiya arrived during the transitional period and she didn't stay long, we can't really say what kind of curriculum she experienced. Arguably, the most important legacy of her time at Kobe is that it nurtured ties. She created ties with Eliza Talcott, who was a missionary and co-founder of the college. One lesson she, that is Sumiya, no doubt took away from her time at Kobe College was that Talcott and the other missionaries abhorred concubinage. The critiques of this practice were not limited to Christian circles. For at the time, Japanese intellectuals debated the status of concubines, and a number of commentators deemed the practice as uncivilized and an obstacle to the state's goal of legal equality with the Western imperial powers. These debates would culminate in the loss of legal status for concubines in 1882. A combination of public debates and Christian discourse no doubt impacted Sumiya's decision to leave, which she resolved to do in 1881. It's ironic that Nakagawa was responsible for bringing Christian missionaries to Okayama, for in the end, she left him after hearing the missionary message. This led him to proclaim that, quote, Jesus stole my mistress. He would later express irritation with other aspects of the faith, notably the focus on temperance. On one occasion, he engaged in a debate about the merits of temperance in a local journal. He suggested that if sake harmed the body, even more people were harmed by encounters with women. How would it be to open up an association that opposed women? The counterpart to temperance, he asked rhetorically. That would lead to the end of humanity. Needless to say, unlike some of his male counterparts who ran in the same circles, he did not join the local temperance association for men, though he did end up giving up drinking near the end of his life. Now to part 2, breaking up and custody battles. Before coming to the decision to leave Nakagawa, Sumiya returned to Okayama from Kobe sometime in 1878 or 1879 at Nakagawa's behest. He could not bear to be without her and sent a telegram falsely claiming that her uncle was critically ill. The only account of the circumstances was written by Belle Petty, one of the Western missionaries, some 17 years after the events, and should be read cautiously. According to Belle, the atmosphere at Nakagawa's house after her return made Sumiya physically ill, and she decided to end the relationship. And this is a very dramatic account that Belle tells, and she says, quote, his friends all urged her to stay, saying he would give up his Christianity if she left him, which is quite odd because Nakagawa actually never converted. But in the end, Belle writes, quote, as she grew stronger, Miss Talcott used her influence with Mr. N, and he finally consented to give her up for a while at least, end quote. Sumiya departed in 1881, leaving Toyo behind at Nakagawa's insistence, which was a common practice in Japan at the time. Sumiya faced immediately serious challenges and she lacked financial support, but she persevered and found employment with one of the missionary ladies teaching Japanese, and this person turns out to have been Belle herself. Whereas missionary records stress the role of Talcott and Petty, later Japanese accounts differ in their insistence that Sumiya had something to teach the Westerners. One notes that, quote, Sumiya worked to make the missionaries realize the virtues of Japanese women and encouraged them to learn these virtues. They learned Japanese without an accent and made a favorable impression on upper-class Japanese women with their charming and gentle attitude, end quote. This was also the period when Sumiya turned to political activism while working to get custody of her daughter, and Nakagawa eventually relented and handed over custody to Sumiya. The missionary network and her own strong will propelled her to take these steps. Now to part 3, separate lives, overlapping causes. For the rest of their lives, Sumiya and Nakagawa devoted themselves to several causes. As I've mentioned, they participated in many of the same networks centered on politics and reform. Sumiya attended the church along with Nakagawa's wife Yuki, her younger sister Onishikino, Yuki's mother, and they both supported the Sanyo Gakuin school. The school, which I'll take up shortly, was closely associated with the church. Now, Nakagawa, in the meantime, took up with another woman whose sources call the widow Watanabe, and he had a son with her who turns out to have been the most successful of the sons. I turn now to examine Nakagawa and Sumiya's participation in 3 areas: associational life, education, and social reform. While I treat these pursuits separately, they overlapped in practice. Along the way, I comment on the ways Sumiya's and Nakagawa's activism differed in focus and style, and consider how we might account for the differences. So Sumiya and women's groups. The Meiji era saw a sharp rise in women's associational life at the local level. In Okayama, there were some 25 groups founded in the years between 1885 and 1890. Sometimes groups were explicitly political and at other times focused on reform. Still other groups were devoted to the task of enlightenment and moral suasion. In 1882, after leaving Nakagawa, Sumiya became involved with a local women's group, loosely affiliated with the Freedom and People's Rights movement, called the Okayama Women's Friendship Society. The society comprised about 40 women who came together twice a month. They discussed political ideas, drafted guidelines for membership, gave speeches, and founded a school. It's not clear how she came to join the group. There seems to have been a lot of overlap with local Christian and people's rights networks. As with Christianity, she may have been first exposed to people's rights ideas during her time at Nakagawa's home because his best friend and next door neighbor, Nishikichi, was a prominent activist. The following year, Sumiya delivered a speech at a local meeting. We don't have the text, but it probably included calls for raising women's status and discussed natural rights based on other women's speeches that are extant. The society's activities ended after 2 years, and the documentary record ends in about 1884. But we know a lot about the individual members. Participation spurred women to other forms of activism, to pursue other forms of activism centered on education and to some extent Christianity. One group helped found the Okayama branch of the Japan Women's Christian Temperance Union, a group which Sumiya also joined. Others opened schools for girls. The society marks one case where Sumiya was involved in a group that did not have direct links to Christianity and missionaries, The group did not discuss religion at its meetings, as far as we know, and the extant records just don't mention Christianity. Now, Nakagawa was involved in men's associations, but of course we don't tend to call them that. Working with groups, however, does not appear to have been his main interest. Along with his friend and neighbor Nishi, Nakagawa participated in the Okayama branch of the Freedom People's Rights Movement. Okayama was a hotbed of people's rights activism, and Nishi led a group of 700 local activists who petitioned for the opening of a national diet or legislature. Nakagawa liked to be in the middle of everything, so his involvement here is not surprising. Unlike many men of his background, though, he didn't run for office. He seems to have preferred acting on his own. In contrast to what appears to have been limited involvement in men's groups, Nakagawa actually founded a women's group, which is not something we normally associate with men, though to be sure, Buddhist men were involved in setting up women's groups for Buddhist women to compete with the Protestant women's groups. In 1885, Nakagawa founded a group called the Gensenkai. He invited male speakers to enlighten female members. As with so many activities about women, we know quite little, but historian Yoshizaki Shioko has pieced together valuable fragments of information. A letter to the editor of a local paper suggests that the group was dominated by men and collapsed within a year. Apparently, women were the objects of reform rather than subjects. Now to education, which both of them were passionately committed to. In 1886, a few years after leaving Nakagawa, Sumiya opened a school together with local missionaries in Okayama. She filed the application with the authorities and identified the school's aim as to educate all interested women of all ages and boys under the age of 15. The school differed from two private girls' schools that opened the same year in neighboring districts. These other schools served the lead daughters, but her school catered to women of all ages and backgrounds. It remained open until 1890 and had 90 students at one point, including a 60-year-old widow. The curriculum included sewing classes on foreign knitting and crocheting and English language study. The school closed in the midst of a wave of anti-Western sentiment, though some sources suggest other factors played a role, including Sumiya's health and problems of the Yokoyama church. But by this point, Sumiya already had other commitments, namely to the Okayama orphanage, which is pictured here and I will talk about a little bit later. The school's existence attests to the role of the missionary network, as well as to the legacy of Sumiya's involvement in the Okayama Women's Friendship Society. It shows how the dramatic growth in schools for girls during this period cannot solely be attributed to the work of missionaries or the Meiji state, but also to the contributions of a loose network of women. Her school also reveals the way different kinds of activism were linked. The local Japan Women's Christian Temperance Union held its meetings at the school. This example offers evidence of how Sumiya built and secured connections among networks. Her ability to network was one of her great strengths. Nakagawa's record on education is even more extensive. He remained a passionate advocate for education throughout his life, and his achievements defy easy summation. One of his first appointments in the prefectural administration sent him around Okayama, where he inspected schools and promoted hygiene. He constantly preached the virtues of modern education and threw himself into the establishment of several schools, including the Sanyo Gakuen School, which is going to keep coming up, the revitalization of the Shizutani School. Now, this was an academy that was founded for male commoners by the Lord of Bizen in 1670 and had closed for a time, but Nakagawa worked with other local people to rebuild the school. He also founded a hospital, a medical school, and a school for midwives. His work in training nurses stood out. Okayama was able to send nurses to the front for the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895. Surely he conducted his pursuits in the context of a network, though the details have not survived, and he gets most of the credit today in prefectural histories and websites devoted to local history. So Christian groups, for sure, including foreign missionaries and Japanese converts, founded many schools in Meiji Japan, but in people like him, we see how their efforts coincided with an already existing commitment to education in Japanese society. Now to social reform, which is an admittedly broad category. It consumed much of Sumiya and Nakagawa's time and energy. The ways they balanced their commitments and engaged in activism differed markedly. Sumiya preferred to act behind the scenes, and Nakagawa was eager to grab center stage. One significant difference concerns their relationship to Christianity. Both were clearly impacted by the faith. However, after converting, Sumiya's life really centers on Christianity at the orphanage and the church. But Nakagawa, as we've seen, never converted. As the missionary Julia Gulick put it, quote, like Noah's carpenters, he continues outside the ark himself, end quote. According to his friend Nishi, Naka took the best from Shinto, Buddhism, and Christianity. He was, according to Nishi, absorbed in correcting deficiencies and guiding people's hearts. Now, Sumiya's work centered on the orphanage and the church. In 1887, she began assisting Ishii Juji, the official founder of the Okayama orphanage. She met him at the church a few years early when he arrived to study medicine, but he would later give up medicine, this is Ishii, and devote himself to child relief. At the time they met, he was 19 and she was 34. She acted as an older sister to him and his young wife and offered spiritual and material support. By the turn of the 20th century, the Okayama orphanage was renowned throughout Japan as a model for social reform, and had even earned the support of Meiji officialdom in the imperial household. Sumiya played an integral role in the life of the institution. In describing her position, Meiji-era texts, as well as more contemporary ones, tend to characterize her work as behind the scenes. Writers refer to her as the shadow director or the orphanage auntie. However, his own writings, Ishii's own writings, suggest something quite different, that Sumiya was very central, and this was hardly hidden to observers at the time. Here is how he characterized her contributions in an 1894 interview. Quote, if one wants to accomplish something, a sympathetic friend is absolutely necessary, or one will not succeed. The achievements of the orphanage are not my own. They are the achievements of Sumiya, end quote. Whereas he highlighted Sumiya's contributions, other contemporaries placed her in a subordinate position. I suspect that scholars and writers, past and present, have been constrained by ideas about gender roles and not known how to characterize Sumiya's important position, and so they call her an assistant because cultural assumptions stand in the way of identifying and describing a woman as performing a leading role. Other examples serve to underscore Sumiya's central position at the orphanage. Ishii was constantly experimenting with new institutions and ideas. He traveled often, and Sumiya ran the orphanage in his absence. From 1894 on, he was at the Chaosubaru settlement in Miyazaki, which was an offshoot of the orphanage, and he left her in charge in Okayama. She traveled to raise funds and wrote letters to members of the community, soliciting donations. All in all, she would appear to have been the steady hand that kept things running in Okayama. Although in her public speeches, she highlighted his role, her own actions reveal her important work. Western missionaries also noted Sumiya's work as a Bible woman. Bible women were salaried employees of the missions. However, they most often worked with individual missionaries rather than large organizations. They enjoyed a great deal of autonomy and did not need to write reports, making an historical accounting of their role challenging. Sakamoto Kiyone suggests that Bible women's work was critical to spreading Christianity in Japan, since Western missionary movements were restricted initially. And of course, Westerners struggled with the language. Here is how the missionary Julia Gulick describes Sumiya in a report to the American Board. Quote, she visits the sick and where occasion requires, remains with them days and nights, looks after the poor of the church and those who have no friends, reminds those who are likely to forget of the regular meetings for women, which she conducts, gives personal notice of special meetings to those who would not hear or heed a general notice. She does much house-to-house visiting, is practically the assistant pastor as well as an evangelist. On the Sabbath, she teaches a class in the church Sunday school and another at the orphan asylum. And she is the trusted friend and advisor of Mr. Ishii, the head of the institution. And this description goes on. I think Gulick here captures Sumiya's competence and the range of her work in a way few other sources do. Now to Nakagawa and social reform. His identity was very much bound up with it, and the way he carried out his efforts left an impression on the audience. I now address the range of his causes and how he went about advocating for them. Nakagawa loved to speak in public, and speech-making was a constant practice. He spoke on street corners. He spoke on horseback while circling the city. He promoted new hairstyles in the 1870s at a time when many people still wore the old top knot. He worried, he wrote, or he said rather, that women wouldn't like it when he cut his hair, but in fact, they loved it. Quote, "I was told you have pluck," end quote. He went on to advise his audience that they too should cut their hair. He used humor and, he used humor to spread ideas about hygiene and new customs. He obtained a storytelling license from the police. His popularity with audiences grew over time. When his favorite comic troupe came to town, he made a special appearance using the performance name Higemaru. One of his biographers likened him to a modern-day Buddhist prophet, given his love of speech-making on busy streets. He spoke next to a banner that proclaimed his identity as a believer in the Buddha and in hygiene and in education. Another banner in his collection contains a drawing of Fukuzawa Yukichi, together with sayings from his friend Nishi, the medieval Buddhist prophet Nichiren, and Jesus Christ. I meant to show you this photo of Julia Gulick earlier, who documented Sumiya's many roles. And this is the banner that Nakagawa used to speak with. After retiring from the bureaucracy in the 1880s, Nakagawa moved to the countryside and raised cattle and sold milk. We have a photo of him with a milk jug. On the occasion of his move in 1886, his change of address announcement in the old literary style proclaimed, "I have become impoverished as of late, and I am moving to Kitamaki village. In order to ensure a long life, I will run a pasture and live modestly. I would be pleased if those who pity me would visit." Still, he maintained a public presence, appearing in Okayama from time to time when he felt called to enlighten his fellow citizens. When electricity came to Okayama in 1894, he went to work to advertise it. He dressed up in a festive, straight-sleeved coat, wore happi, and wore trousers and beat a drum while explaining the issue to audiences. He was similarly moved to act during a cholera outbreak, where he wore a demon mask and high-heeled clogs while expounding on the importance of proper hygiene. So the biggest thing that Nakagawa did, I'm going to call a funeral. I mentioned that he never converted to Christianity, that he was surrounded by Christians. His wife and cousin and mother-in-law attended the Okayama church along with his former concubine, and he supported the Sanyo Gakuen school for girls, which was closely linked to the church. Here's Sanyo. His public performance on behalf of the school is what we turn to next. For in 1899, he hatched a plan to help save the school from financial disaster. He placed the following announcement in a local paper, and it was picked up by newspapers in Tokyo and Osaka. It read, quote, "I would like to announce that on the 27th at 2 p.m. at Kunitomi Shorinji Temple, I will die for a time. I have determined that I will not deal with any tasks thereafter apart from 3 pursuits: education, hygiene, and raising cattle. I would also like you to bring as many incense offerings as possible." This was customary for funerals. "Please keep in mind that the more, the better." The end of the quote. Nakagawa also noted in a separate will distributed to friends that he would need at least 2 pallbearers who would switch off during the ceremony because he was such a large man. Nakagawa explained that he had reached old age and was giving up all his engagements, but the school was having a hard time making ends meet. He hoped the money people brought as an offering would be donated to the school. On the day of the actual event, Nakagawa was in fine form. He hired geisha to give him the ritual bath. At the beginning of the ceremony, he stood naked in a wash tub in front of a crowd with standing room only. He drew himself up to his full height while geisha dried him and dressed him in white burial clothes. He then entered the coffin. Monks processed in front of it. The priest intoned sutras. Monks processed in front of it. From time to time, a voice came from the coffin urging the priest to hurry up, which of course led the crowd to erupt in laughter. The priest ignored the disruption and proceeded with the rituals. Near the end of the service, Nakagawa yelled from the coffin, "It's cold and I can't stand it." He emerged and stared at the laughing audience out of the corner of his eye. He went to a waiting room and changed, emerging in Western clothing. He then proceeded to deliver a disjointed text, We don't have the exact text today, but we do have an earlier version thanks to the work of historian Ota Kenichi. In addition to stressing education, the speech highlighted the need for hygiene and proper sewage to prevent the spread of cholera and typhus and to protect the health of the local economy and its inhabitants. He highlighted the need to invest in schools and infrastructure. If the surviving script is any clue, this speech rambled, although it was punctuated with memorable declarations. For instance, at one point, Nakagawa exclaimed, quote, "Representative government may not care about hygiene or rotting brains, but I, the illiterate Yokotarō, truly do," end quote. His efforts moved the audience. Kajiro Yoshi, a teacher at the Sanyo School and its future principal, was reported to have wept. Presumably, she was overwhelmed by his generosity. Clearly, Nakagawa liked to put on a good show, while Sumiya adopted a less flamboyant approach. When she wished to help out the school, she donated hairpins and expensive dogs. Their differences can in part be attributed to gender roles. Other aspects boil down to individual personalities. In the case of running the orphanage, Sumiya explicitly did not draw attention to herself. In response to Ishii's plea to Sumiya for assistance when he set up the orphanage, she replied, apparently, quote, "Of course I will be a founder and take responsibility. However, because I am a woman, I do not wish to put my name out in public. I ask to be an anonymous founder. As your partner, I will work tirelessly." End quote. Her candor is striking, and yet her strategy was not unusual. Sumiya's words remind us how women may enter realms that are formally off limits through various strategies, including the use of non-threatening language. In this case, she chose not to discuss her founding role at all. Her reluctance may also have stemmed from the early modern legacy of women performing work in the interior Ura. Her lack of discussion of herself extended to her public writing. In 1893, she wrote an essay for the prominent women's journal, Jogakuzashi, entitled "I Recommend Against Becoming a Geisha or Concubine." In it, she critiqued both roles and exhorted women who were serving as geisha not to become concubines. She did not mention her own experience, though her name would have struck people as sounding like a geisha name. Now for endings. Nakagawa died in 1903 at the age of 67, 4 years after his spectacular staged funeral. His 1903 crowd, the actual funeral crowd, drew more than 2,000 attendees, including a number of students who had attended the schools with which he was associated. His friends erected a stone monument in 1911 in Higashiyama Park, but it was later moved to its present location next to the Okayama Castle moat. Its position next to the castle with the modern city as a backdrop seems fitting for a man who straddled old and new. Today, a local tourist pamphlet claims that the current location is near the horse grounds where Nakagawa once worked. Sumiya lived on for another 17 years, during which time she continued to work at the orphanage, though eventually much of the orphanage was transferred to Miyazaki. The network she participated in during her earlier decades occupied her, and after Ishii's death, she stepped up her travels as an evangelist. Not surprisingly, there is no physical trace of Sumiya's presence on the Okayama landscape today except for her grave, nothing like the stone monument to Nakagawa. And here is her grave, which was largely forgotten until 2008, when local researchers rediscovered it. Now for the conclusion. What are some of the takeaways from this treatment of Nakagawa and Sumiya's lives? I began with the contention that studying men and women together provides a richer view of gendered lives and how subjectivities changed across the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The changes following the Restoration offered Nakagawa and Sumiya a chance to start over. Importantly, they enjoyed new opportunities to fashion the self as reformers in a public sphere, in a new public sphere. And they were also, as I explore elsewhere, key nodes in local networks. In the Meiji period, Nakagawa was a prefectural official and a local notable. Such men called to mind the presence of the new nation state and how it reached down to local society. Nakagawa was unusual in the range and kind of causes he took on and the ways he went about advocating for them with his penchant for publicity. As a mostly illiterate samurai, what would Nakagawa's life have been like had the Tokugawa period continued? He would not have been able to craft an identity as a well-known reformer. Pretty much every Meiji oligarch who visited Okayama had heard of Nakagawa. The institutions of Meiji Japan also enabled Sumiya to forge a new identity as a single woman reformer. In the late Tokugawa period, she had authority as a teacher of dance, and the musical form Naga-uta, but the stature of women like her was periodically under threat. Some scholars speculate that had the Tokugawa period continued, her family would have adopted a husband for her to continue the line, and she would not have had to become a geisha. In any case, beginning in the 1880s, she carved out a space for herself as a leader in her community, though the textual traces are scarce and require often reading against the grain. Her position of authority outside of a business or household was unusual, especially as an unmarried woman. And one thing I talk about a lot in the book is the rise of actually several unmarried lifelong single women in Okayama and their roles. Sumiya's life is a reminder of other trajectories for women during this period of flux beyond the good wife, wise mother ideal. This ideology took hold around the turn of the 20th century among middle-class women, but often gets applied to all women after 1868. To be sure, she was not the only woman in a leadership role, but there is no pre-existing social category like local notable or official to insert her into. Nor does she fit the normal division scholars apply to Meiji women, where women are either based in households or available for hire. Clearly, reform movements propelled individuals into new roles. All of this talk of publicity leads me to the public. How should we think about Nakagawa and Sumiya's place in public? His identities as an official and local notable placed him squarely in the public realm. Sumiya's case is less straightforward. She carried out her work in what British historian Leonore Davidoff has called the social. The idea of separate spheres does not work here, but nor did men and women access the public in the same way. In addition to considering their lives and what changed across the Meiji divide, I also wish to highlight continuities. Both continued to write or dictate letters in the Sorobun epistolary style. Both had spent part of their life in the Tokugawa period and were shaped by it. Early modern understandings of women's role informed Sumiya's behind-the-scenes work, and Nakagawa's living funeral, while quirky in the Meiji period, had early modern precedents. In both cases, modern print media amplified their audiences. Readers around the country had access to Sumiya's essay on concubinage. Similarly, knowledge of Nakagawa's living funeral, where he was reborn, and his performances reached a greater number of people owing to the circulation of regional and national newspapers. Now to a few loose ends. First, the fate of daughter Toyo. Like her mother, she attended Kobe College. Sumiya's natal family adopted a son-in-law for her to marry named Aoki Yokichi. Aoki had attended Yale and Columbia and was an entrepreneur who was also, for a time, a principal at Sanyo Gakuen. From a different angle, I want to call attention to a shift in social practices the story reveals, specifically the decline of concubinage. When Nakagawa met Sumiya in 1868, concubinage was common, and by the turn of the century, it was increasingly not. Finally, this particular narrative is one that does not stress patriarchy as an overarching structure. It's part of the story, but my goal again has been to attempt to emphasize what Canning calls the reciprocal inflection of gender relations. One trend we do begin to see is the gradual differentiation of public activity by gender in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a point I develop further in the book. And we can see here an all women's group at the Okayama Church that includes both Japanese and foreign women. Sumiya is in the back row in the middle. Overall, when we talk about Meiji Japan, abstract processes of state and nation building tend to loom large. Here I have adopted a different approach. Perhaps the greatest takeaway is a more nuanced view of how modernization impacted people, how the presence of new institutions and ideas changed lives, giving some the chance to forge a new path. Sumiya and Nakagawa carried with them elements of the past, even as they forged new roles or inhabited existing roles in unconventional ways. Thank you.